An Introduction to Vue with Raymond Camden.
All right, so hopefully at this point you are actually seeing my slide deck, and we'll be hopping back and forth between slides and code and the browser. And if I go too fast, just let me know, specifically Brian. And everything I'm showing today, you can definitely grab later. You can watch the recording, and let's actually get started. So, hi, I'm Raymond Camden. I work with developer experience at Amex, so don't leave home without me. And that's like the best joke I have. It's kind of all downhill from there, unfortunately. I blog at raymondcamden.com. I have a contact form there, and if you have any questions about Vue.js or any questions about anything, really, drop me a line and I'd be happy to try to help you out. A lot of times those questions turn into cool blog posts, so don't be worried about bothering me. I live for your questions. I also tweet at Raymond Camden, and you should definitely follow me because I only tweet super serious, important stuff. So follow me, and I'll say that my DMs are open. So if you have, again, any questions at all, I am happy to do my best to try to help you. So I'm going to kind of talk first about why Vue.js, and as you could probably guess, this is going to be a pretty personal section of the presentation. I don't necessarily expect that my personal reasons will matter to you, but I had spent a lot of time using Angular before, and I've looked at React, and Vue just really, really worked for me. And I think it's kind of helpful to explain like why it worked well for me. But even before we do that, it's probably a good idea to talk about why we would add a framework to our code, because doesn't that make the download slower? Isn't that just adding more dependencies and all that? I have been using frameworks in my code for probably 10 plus years, and it's just kind of naturally obvious to me. But I do remember the time before that when it wasn't obvious to me. So I do like to kind of remind people why we do this. Why we add a couple more K to our download to do something for our projects. That came out horribly. I apologize. So probably the biggest reason I use frameworks like Vue.js is that when I'm starting a new project, I don't want to spend time thinking about how to organize stuff. Now that seems silly, but again, I can remember starting a project and kind of struggling with what I name a folder. And that felt really dumb to me. Like, why do I have to even think about this? At that time, I adopted a framework. It had a particular thing that it wanted you to use for the folders for this and the folders for that. And I loved it. I loved just not thinking about that and getting more into my business logic or the actual particular features of what I was building. To me, that's probably the biggest reason. I don't want to think about organization. I kind of want to be told how to organize my code and just kind of go from there. And another big reason is having features and just stuff kind of baked in. So I'm not necessarily having to grab a third-party library because it's built in. So to me, that kind of explains why you would use a particular framework. So now I kind of want to go back into why I would use Vue.js and why I've been using Vue.js pretty much extensively for the last year or so. Number one reason is that it is incredibly simple. Now, certainly what's simple to me may not be simple to you, but I have found that Vue just has a very approachable, very kind of practical usage that is just great to pick up. I did like Angular, but I didn't necessarily find it to be the easiest framework to use. The other thing that I like is that there's no build process involved. So whenever I would do something with Angular, I would never kind of like just on the fly say, hey, I'm going to build something with Angular, because I knew that there was a process to set it up. There was a CLI to scaffold an application. And to be clear, I'm not saying those are bad things. I'm not saying using the build process is bad. What I'm saying, though, for me, for learning, the fact that Vue was much simpler to use and that I could just drop a script tag in made me much more inclined to play with it. What I like about this is that I could have a big Vue project, for a client or whatever, and I'm stuck at one particular small thing. I could hop into a tool like CodePen, and you're going to see me using CodePen a lot today. I could hop into CodePen, drop a quick script tag in, test what I need to with Vue.js, and just have it work, and learn what I needed to do and get back to my project. Now, I'm not saying React and Angular can't work that way. I'm really kind of basing it on my experience with Angular a couple of years ago, but I just felt more just more approachable to me. I felt like I could play a heck of a lot more, and when I play, I tend to learn. Now, Vue does have a build process. It has a scaffolding tool. And to me, that makes Vue awesome. So if I am not building a JavaScript application with a capital A and all that, and I feel like no one talks about using JavaScript outside of single page applications. No one talks about, having a page that already exists and just adding a little bit of interactivity. Maybe that's not fun, cool, and exciting anymore, but I still find like a lot of my work is someone coming in and say, hey, can you just add this little bit of interactivity to this existing like HTML list of products? So the fact that Vue supports working on the small, working on just simple page enhancements, as well as really nicely supports building full single page applications. I love that Vue kind of has my back there throughout the entire process and throughout different types of applications. And again, I'm not saying you can't like drop React onto a page. I'm sure that's possible, but that's not something that I've seen very often. So just some quick Vue facts about the framework itself. It was created by Evan You way back in 2014. Speaking for myself, I know that I had been attending conferences for a while and seeing intro to Vue.js talks with typically like 5 people in the room at the time. It has certainly become a lot more popular in the last couple of years. I don't think it's as popular as React, but that's fine by me. It's currently in version 2.16. I say currently. I checked this last Wednesday. It's definitely possible that there was a point upgrade in the last couple of days. As you know, everything changes every day. It's hard to keep up, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to find out more, there is a website, of course, at Vue.js.org. And if you want to see the GitHub repo, it's at /Vue.js. So what does Vue do? So I am probably going to make the Vue people angry because I'm going to take the 10,000 really cool things that Vue.js does, and I'm just going to condense it down into like 3 bullet points. To me, when I'm learning something new, it may have 10 features, but there's 1, there's 2, there's 3 features that I use every day or that are more crucial to me, and that's kind of what I want to do here. So number 1 is providing two-way binding between your DOM and your JavaScript. And your DOM is just where your HTML and your CSS, and basically what end users see. So Vue makes it really easy to bind that to JavaScript data. It also has a template language, what they call declarative rendering. If you've ever used a tool like Handlebars, Mustache, Jade, or Pug as it is known now, this is a way to write expressions in HTML and have a library kind of take them over and make them dynamic. If you've ever built a really big string in jQuery and the $dom.html equals that string, then you know that that's not optimal. Using a tool that supports a template language allows you to work in HTML when you're trying to render HTML, and ends up being a lot easier to use. So again, just to be clear, Vue does more than 2 things. I'm definitely going to be showing you more than 2 things today. But those 2 bullet points are what, to me, Vue does best. And I'm going to dramatically pause here as I take a sip of tea. All right, thank you. So installation, if you want, you could use npm install. There's also a CLI. You could download it from the site or just copy and paste a script tag. And you get one guess as to what I prefer. So most of my examples will be just using a script tag. I'm actually going to be using CodePen a lot, so you won't actually see the script tag, but that's essentially what I'm doing. Again, to me, I think this makes it a heck of a lot easier to play with Vue.js. So that is the CDN URL. Again, if you want to, you can download Vue. And there is a production version and a development version that you should switch based on where you are working. Or just copy and paste this and play and learn. So let's write some code. So one of the first things that you're going to have to figure out with Vue, and this was a bit weird for me, is that you're going to first begin by identifying where you're going to render stuff. And I got some more information about that coming up. You'll then set up some data, and the data depends on what you're doing. So if you're working with Ajax, you'll load that data. If you're working with a form, you may create defaults for the form fields. Whatever your particular thing that you're building, you'll just set up that data. You'll then actually render that data. I'll show you how that works in Vue.js. And then you'll add events. So for example, on a button click, run this particular method. And that's basically it. So let's talk a bit more about how you identify what Vue is going to be working with and why this is important. So if you're coming from a jQuery perspective, typically you drop jQuery onto a page, and then you begin doing stuff. So you say, I want to change that HTML. I want to change this other HTML and change this graphic. And jQuery doesn't care. Just as long as you can find the particular DOM item on the page, it will let you work with it. Vue is a bit different. When you begin working with it, the first thing you have to do is tell it, hey, in the DOM, what do you care about? So in this particular example, and this was me using all of my UI skills, I'm very proud of this. I have decided that I'm only going to work with those two parts of the DOM. Now, if later on the client comes back and says, hey, can you also work with this table over there? That's okay. I will just make a new Vue application. What's cool about this is that those two Vue applications have zero communication. So if I did not name a variable very well, if I just have a variable called like data, for example, I don't have to worry about the variable name in the first Vue application conflicting with the second one. There's a firewall between them. They are totally separate. If I want to cheat and just say like everything you see on screen there is my Vue application, I can do that as well. So I'm going to walk you through a set of examples. It's going to be pretty simple, but we're going to kind of build up over time. If you want to see these examples, go to bit.ly, that's bit.ly/RayVueDemos. This will be a CodePen collection. I believe it's in the same order, but it may not be. But all the different examples are hopefully named appropriately enough so that you can view them. But again, all these examples are in CodePen. You can play with them, run them yourself, fork them, and go crazy. So let's start off with like the simplest Vue application there is. On the right, I have my JavaScript. I'm creating a new Vue object. I am defining the place where Vue will work. In this case, I'm using a selector, #app, to point to a div tag that I have in my HTML. I'm then specifying my data, and this is kind of arbitrary. It's based on whatever I'm building. This will actually not do anything. And technically, it's building a Vue application, but I'm not actually rendering anything in my HTML, so the user won't see anything. If I want to begin actually showing things to the user, I will start using that template language that I was talking about earlier. On the page here, on the slide, you can see bracket, bracket, name, close bracket, close bracket. When I set up a new Vue application, when I tell it to use this DOM item, and you can see it with the L property on the right-hand side there, it will know to look in that DOM item for template tokens to begin replacing. In this case, replacing name and age with the values you see there. Now, this is a pretty dumb demo, but I love to show dumb demos. And hopefully this is big enough. I'll make it a little bit bigger. And you can see my data here. You can see my HTML. I could change my age to be appropriate, and it automatically updates. And I could change the HTML here, and it should just work. Now, what I like about this is that I can work in my HTML, keep it nice and simple, and I have no logic there, and my actual data is separate in JavaScript. So you could imagine working with maybe an intern who knows basic HTML, just kind of tell them, say, hey, when you want to render a name, use the bracket, and they don't have to worry about JavaScript at all. And I think that's pretty darn cool. So let's build on this a bit more. Vue also supports a basic conditional. So if something is true, then render it. Along with a basic if condition, you can see I'm doing this with a v-if. I could also do a v-else and of course a else if as well. So this is basically how you would handle showing content based on a data value. And if something is true, show it. If something is not true, show it instead. So that demo. Yes, thank you for warning me. I have my data here, age 44. My condition here, basically if my age is over 40, I remember floppies. If I take a magic pill and get really young, let's say 4 years old, then the condition updates automatically. All right. Again, hopefully still kind of simple. By the way, I'll definitely have time for Q&A at the end. And like I said, my Twitter DMs are open. You can contact me via email as well. So we looked at conditions. We can also do looping. That's going to be one more v-attribute. In this case, I'm saying for something in data. So in things means look at the data value for things, which in this case is an array. And when I say thing in, I'm essentially saying, hey, name each iteration of that array thing. So those are definitely not great variable names, but hopefully you get an idea. And we'll look at this demo. This is my third demo, and yes, thank you for warning me. Minimize the CSS. There is my array of data. There is that v4. And by the way, the v4 can be applied to any element as all. So if I wanted to, and I'm doing some live coding here, I can do foo and things and render foo and paragraphs, if I could type, instead of a list item. That's totally fine. And if I go in here and add one more thing, what's better than beer? More beer. And we can see it updates easy peasy. All right, so again, just kind of basically showing you small examples of what you could do with Vue. The next thing would be working with form fields to tie in. This really calls back to the two-way data binding I mentioned earlier. So Vue supports a v-model, works in all form fields, and it basically says link the data in this form field to data in my Vue application. You can see an example on screen there. Well, let's go to the code pen where we can actually run this. And yep, I am fine not saving that. All right, so I have a simple text field and I have a select field as well. And I mentioned vModel works with everything, so I'm just showing two here. I am binding that text field to name, and you can see name defaults to Ray. And so my basic HTML output is showing it, my form field is showing it. As I type, it automatically updates. And with basically just the vModel, and I'm done. If I change that value of cool from false to true, because of course I'm true, the select field automatically updates as well. So again, really, really easy two-way data binding just with that v-model. To work with events, the basic syntax is going to be v-on the event type, click, submit, etc., and then something, where something will be a method that you will write in a new part of your Vue application. And you can see that on the upper left-hand side there. I've added a methods block to my Vue application, and inside I have a method called doIt. My HTML is saying v-on-click run doIt. Vue also supports adding simple modifiers to the event. If you've ever done a form submit JavaScript action, then you're used to stopping the normal form submission from happening. Well, Vue allows you to simply do submit.prevent, and it'll do that prevent for you out of the box. Because event handling happens so often, there's a shorthand where you can just do @event name equals something. So let's look at an example of this. And take a sip of tea again. All right, I wish I could make CodePen default to CSS closed. So I have a simple demo here with a button where I'm saying v-on-click equals doIt. And all this button does is increment a value. Now I want to point something out to you. Notice in doIt, I'm using this.count. The this scope in Vue methods automatically maps to your data values. So it's not data.count or this.data.count. It's simply this dot and then whatever the data value is. So as I hit doIt, it runs the events automatically. So pretty simple. And again, I could do this shorthand like that, @click, and it saves me a few keystrokes. All right, so moving on, another feature is attribute binding. This is talking about specific attributes in your HTML. So for example, image source attributes. The syntax for that is v-bind, the attribute, and the data value you want to bind to. There's also a shorthand where you can drop the v-bind and just use :attribute equals value. So if you wanted to have an image that was bound to some Vue data, this is how you would do it. Vue also does some really nice things with styling. I'm going to show two examples on screen here where I can bind style values or class values to Vue data. So for example, if isActive was false, the highlighted class would be automatically removed from whatever DOM item I'm using. As soon as it becomes true, Vue will add that class to the DOM item. Same for the style example on the third line as well. As text style changes, Vue will automatically update the font style value to match whatever text style equals. So I don't do much with CSS because I make things uglier. But I can show you an example where we use the image tag. I have a image tag here with v-bind :source. Note that you can mix and match those v- attributes. I'm actually defaulting source to null until you click a button. So basically all this says is if the if the source value doesn't exist yet, don't have the image in the DOM at all. As soon as it exists, show up and bind source to the value of whatever source is. My button has a method called changePick. You'll see I have an array of images here. And all changePick is going to do is iterate over that array. When it gets to the end, set it back to 0. And it sets this.source to the current position in the array. So as I click, you can see I got pictures of a cat, one more cat, and then my kids. Simple as that. If I click one more time, I go back to the first item in the array. All right. So another feature, this is probably one of my favorite ones, are computed properties. So these are virtual properties. And what I mean by that is I want to have some particular value, let's say X. And instead of mapping directly to Vue data value from X, it's actually mapped to two different ones or maybe some other logic. So this will be defined in a new part of the Vue instance called computed. And it really kind of sells it if you see kind of a before and after example. So on screen, what I have here is an array of cats. And every cat has a name and every cat has a gender, either male or female. And I wanted to separate that in my HTML. So you can see I have a v-for, I'm iterating over every cat, But I've combined that with a VIF where I check first for the male string and then for the female string. Now this works fine, but you're probably thinking, yeah, what if I change the gender property, maybe to .gnd or something, whatever. I don't want my HTML to be brittle and have JavaScript code break the complete rendering process. So typically, I want less logic to be in my HTML. And this is actually why things like handlebars would not support this at all. Now, I appreciate that Vue lets me do this. I feel like if I wanted to, thank you, Vue, for allowing me. But let's look at a much nicer example of this using computed properties. So what I've done is I've added a computed block, and I've added two new functions. Those functions become values that my HTML can use. I defined a function for male cats, and I defined a function for female cats. By the way, you'll notice that I'm using a fat arrow function, kind of fancy newish JavaScript. Vue does not require you to do this. You don't have to write your code like this. I was trying to be fancy and show off, and that's why I did it. It also made it fit on the slide a bit better. But now look at my HTML. It has zero idea what makes up a male cat. And in fact, I could switch these computed properties to just data properties with hard-coded values as well, and my HTML won't care, it won't matter. And really, that's the way that it should be. So again, I love that property. So again, just kind of going on this tour of different things you can do in Vue. There are life cycle events. So basically, as Vue is doing stuff, if you care, then you can you can hook into that and run code. Now, those are all the life cycle events that you can work with. I'm definitely not going to show them all or explain every single one of them. They all are all properly documented. The one that I tend to use the most is created as a way of saying, hey, when you're starting up, do something. So in this example, I wanted to have a set of data based on a remote API. So what I did was I used the created event to say, hey, when this Vue application is created, do a fetch against the Star Wars API, get the list of results back, and then set those results to a data value, in this case, films, and render that out. Now, I will run this, even though it's kind of boring. It pretty much does what you expect. And did I miss a demo? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So this is the computed one. It does just work. No big surprise there. If I change Alfred from male to female, then we'll see Alfred switch over. No big deal. It works. Let's go into the 8th demo. This is the one using Ajax, and it just kind of works. So, my HTML has no idea where films came from. Again, I keep using this example of two people working, and what's really nice is that API was dead for weeks. I could set up fake data, let my HTML person do whatever they want, use UL, LI, do styling and all that. When the API is working again, I can just swap it out and they are good to go. And again, just a quick pause. Let me get some more tea. And what we're going to do is actually look at a full example. Now, this full example is pretty minimal. I am assuming we all know about form validation. My very first web job back in like 95 or so was doing form validation with CGI scripts, Perl CGI scripts on that. Basically, we're going to check the form on submit and report on top. Obviously, you could do this other ways. You could check as you move in and out of different form fields. You could show errors next to form fields. This is just what I chose for this particular example. I should point out that there's a really good Vue.js cookbook, and it has a cookbook entry on form validation. So let me go into this. All right, so this is my example, and I want to show one more thing while I'm here. This v-cloak CSS thing here, this is how you handle while Vue is loading, hide stuff like this. You don't want people to see the colon stuff. If I add vcloak to the DOM section where Vue is working, and I use this particular CSS, when Vue is done loading, it knows to remove this automatically. So do note that I have an event handler for my form right there. And in my form, I'm using vModel. So Vue has access to, in this case, name, age, and favorite movie, and that's it. So the code's pretty minimal. I have my error handling on top, and I'm basically saying if there are any errors at all, then simply iterate over the errors and show each one. The code is extremely minimal. I have initial values for my form, this is nulls for all, and then I have the logic to check for each one. So in this case, I have said name and age are required, but favorite movie was not. So if we go back here, let's open a new tab. And this will be as exciting as you can imagine. I'll submit my form, and as I type stuff in, the errors change. And if I just do this, it's going to submit to Postman and just echo back the data. So that's a simple example of form validation. Ajax search is another one where you basically accept user input, send to a remote API, and then render the responses. So for this example, I have a input field on top. That's where my my search input is going to be, and then I have a button that's going to render. Fire off on click a search method. I then use a div where I iterate over results and render each of my items. In this case, I'm using the iTunes API, and you can see it in my code. I'm also using this as a quick example of Vue filters. I didn't really talk about this before. Vue has a feature called filters that really act more like formatters. And what I've done here is simply define a simple date formatter. And if we go back in the HTML, you can see I'm using that right there. So that's a pretty cool Vue feature. I'm just kind of sneaking it in here. And if we run this, go back to my examples, Ajax search, we will search for Depeche Mode because they're the best band ever. And you can see the results. So these are definitely not rocket science awesome demos, but these two demos are what I have probably done the most of the last 20 or so years. You know, form validation and doing basic API hits to search for data and return them. So let's kick it up a bit more, talk about components. So a component is basically a way to kind of reuse logic in a Vue application. It contains a template, you know, what you see, the logic for whatever it's doing, and styling that is specific just to that component. And it also kind of solves a big problem that HTML has had for a long time. You know, I mentioned I've been working with HTML for 20 plus years, and so far they have not added a Nicolas Cage tag, which I just find incredibly depressing. So let's look at how we can use components to add Nicolas Cage into our code. So I can use the Vue API to define a component like you see on screen here. I define my template. This is the HTML. In this case, it's really, really short, just an image, but I could have more HTML in there. I talked earlier about how I don't like to write HTML in JavaScript. There's definitely a way to create components without doing this particular syntax. This is the easiest way of doing it, so I'm showing it, but just going to keep that in mind. I have data like a regular Vue application. I have computed properties. All of this is specific to just this component, and a component can also expose properties that it accepts that I can then pass in. So once I've defined that Nicolas Cage component, I can drop it into my HTML like that. Now, this definitely needs to be demoed because it's the most awesome thing ever. We'll go into our Nicolas Cage, and you can see there I've dropped in the Nicolas Cage tag. I have a second example with specific width and height, and all this is doing is running the component I've defined on top. And In case you're curious, yes, there's an image placeholder service for Nicolas Cage. If I change this to a different size, I should see some other picture. So that's kind of a dumb example, although Nicolas Cage is pretty cool. Some better examples, there is a Google Statics Map component for Vue.js. One of the coolest APIs ever, if you've never heard about it, is the Google Statics Map API. If you're a big Bootstrap fan, I definitely am, there are a set of components to work with Bootstrap. There's also a set of UI components called Vuetify, which do a great material layout. I really like Vuetify, but if you prefer Bootstrap, you can make use of it. And to really kind of sell the power of components, as much as I like Bootstrap, I kind of hated all the divs and the classes. And I didn't hate it, but I always had to look that up because it wasn't very obvious what particular div or class would create tabs. Look at how you do it using the Vue Bootstrap components. That is incredibly readable. It's just B-tabs and B-tab. Now, what that Vue component is doing is basically rewriting it to all those particular classes and all that, but I freaking love how simple that is. So more component stuff. I'm going to do this a bit quick so we can get to the other items that I want to talk about it. You can pass data to a component from the parent. You can listen for events from the component. So for example, if I wanted to know when my Nicolas Cage image loaded, my component can expose that event. They also support something called slots, which are really good for handling cases like this, where I have a property that may have a lot of text, and I don't want to specify it as an attribute. I can instead simply create a slot where my component will look for that value and then do whatever. So that's just an example of one particular slot. A component could have multiple slots, and where I have used this myself is I built a quiz handler in Vue.js. Basically show question 1, show question 2, and at the end show a score. And I've made it so that my component allowed you to customize the scoring message at the end by doing like what you see on screen there. So for the next two examples, I'm just going to kind of talk about them high level. I'm not going to share examples. I do have examples. So Vue does support routing. Everything so far has not really been an application. It's been more of a, drop a script tag in. If you are building an application and need routing, Vue has it. It's not part of the Vue library, but there is an official library called Vue-router. And handles things like if I'm at a particular location, I want to use a particular component. It handles knowing when you switch. It handles nested routing. It handles dynamic routing. It gets extremely complex. The code to use it is pretty simple. You can see an example on screen here where basically I'm saying for this path, you use this particular component. And then I could essentially pass a Vue router instance into my Vue application, and that's it. So one more example, one more thing I'll point out. If you want to support something like, I want a header to always be there, but as I route through my application, I want to change the contents on the inside, that's done with a simple router view tag. The router will handle changing just that portion and leaving everything else alone. My code pin does have an example, but for time's sake, I'll skip over it for now because it essentially just works. And I'll skip the full example. Again, all my code's available for download if you want to see that in action. Another pretty important feature or thing that people do with Vue is state management. And to be clear, this solves a problem you may not have, where when you begin working with a lot of components and you have a lot of data, it can get a bit complex. So if you have one component or one Vue application, you have one set of data and you're okay. When you have two components, you may have two sets of data. Well, how do you handle knowing when something changes to one component versus another? And it begins to scale to a point where it may get hard to use. Routing also creates a problem where if I'm on the first page of my application, how does the second page of my application know things like the current user? Well, there's a tool called Vuex, which is essentially another library deeply integrated that handles what they call a store. And I put that in quotes because I had never heard of a store before. Apparently, it's a pretty common term for React folks, but I don't use React. But essentially, it's a way of saying I have like a lockbox of data that my components can read from, but cannot directly change that data. So I built a full example, again, that you could use or that you could view by looking at my CodePen sets, where I built a stock game where what you see on screen here, the current list price of stocks, how much I hold, and the total value, and the UI to buy and sell stocks, all of those things are different components. All of the data driving them comes from one store or one Vuex example. Vuex definitely could have a full hour or a couple hours to talk about it. It's more of an FYI for when you begin to build more powerful, larger Vue applications. So speaking of that, there is a CLI. This is a scaffolding tool. It is focused on building single page applications, but it also supports prototyping as well. You can find out more at cli.vue.js.org. To be clear, you don't need to use the CLI. You can use Vue for simple page enhancements and be successful for the next decade. I'm not worried about that. But if you do want to build applications, you really want to look at the CLI. It also supports single file components, and I will steal an example from the docs where, if you remember my Nicolas Cage example where I had the HTML and my JavaScript, that sucks. And I would much rather write something like you see on screen here, where this one particular file represents a component. I have a nice block for my HTML, a nice block for my logic, and a nice block for whatever styling I want to apply just to that component. Again, the CLI could definitely be a full hour on its own, and it's really more of a day two using Vue type thing versus day one. I don't like to overwhelm people too much, but just going to keep that in mind as something that you could play with. But wait, there's even more. So I'm just going to throw some more links at you. There is a DevTools extension that works really well, especially with Vuex. It even supports things like a history. So if I'm using Vuex to store my data and my data is changing over time, the DevTools extension actually gives you like, at this time, I changed this. It gives you that type of history view. It's really freaking neat. If you're looking at building static applications, Nux is a great tool to look at. Also, GridSum, which I don't have a link for on here, but that's the one I'm excited about. My go-to person for Vue, the person that I have learned the most from, is Sarah Drasner, and a lot of her Vue.js stuff is on CSS Tricks. I've linked to the first article that she wrote in, I think, a 4-part series about learning Vue.js. If I have totally failed you today, please look at her series. Or even if you're happy with what I did, look at her series. Look at all of her Vue.js blog entries. They are amazing. She is absolutely amazing. Definitely read her stuff. I mentioned the cookbook. Vue has one. It's still kind of new, so the content is growing, but it's something that you want to check out. And if you want to look at my Vue.js stuff, that particular link will get you to a page. It's reverse chronological, so you may want to start at the bottom and work your way up. All right, more tea. Okay, so we're going to go into Q&A. Before I do that, I want to talk about something very personal and absolutely a bit off topic. And this is a bit hard to say, so if I stumble a bit more, just please be patient. A year ago, actually, I was going to be presenting for Brian for Certified Fresh Events. And it was about this time, and my wife texted me to say that she was having chest pain. About an hour and a half later, she died from a very sudden and quick heart attack. So that was a very extreme, large impact on my life. And the reason that I'm sharing this now with you is that I very quickly sought professional help via a therapist. And if you follow me on Twitter, you know that I'm very kind of vocal about this. It was a lifesaver for me. If you are going through anything at all, it doesn't have to be death, whatever you may be going through, and we're all going through something, I just want to urge you to consider seeing a therapist. And I asked my therapist like what link to share for like finding a therapist in your area. Psychologytoday.com would be where you'd want to consider going. Having a neutral person to speak to about what I was going through literally saved my sanity. So I really, really want to urge you, if you are suffering or even if you're not suffering, to consider speaking to a therapist. I mentioned that my DMs are open. If you have some questions about this, I will absolutely keep them private. You are 100% welcome to come to me and ask me about this, and I will give you the brutal, honest truth about what I did and what I went through and how it helped and etc. But I just want to share that before moving on. And yes, Carol will be judging your questions. She's a stern judge. But I'm going to close the PowerPoint and also stop sharing my screen. If I can remember how to do that, close video. Okay, so now it's just my face. And I can see the Q&A at the end. And by the way, if I miss some of your questions, again, definitely hit me up. I'm gonna scroll back a little bit, but okay. I'm just gonna pick the first one that's not related to the video itself. And yeah, Claudia, you're asking about my code. Everything's on CodePen except the full examples. If you want that, please drop me an email. I can definitely zip that up for you. I've been meaning to put this entire slide deck on GitHub, but I'm not sure when. Dan mentioned in the comments about Code Sandbox. Yeah, it's really, really good for Vue. Code Sandbox to me is good for Vue applications. I prefer CodePen for my simple Vue example. So if you don't want to work with the CLI, but you want to test out building an application, Code Sandbox is great. It has probably the most performant website I've seen in 20 years. Seeing more examples. Rob, thank you for that. Rob shared an example of how to open with the CSS panel closed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to modify those links to have that. And I actually don't see any. Oh, I see a last. Oh, Daniel Garcia, thank you for asking that. So Daniel's asking, for making Ajax call, what is the preferred method to use that supports all the browsers? So that brings up two things. So number one, Vue does not have Ajax baked in because Vue doesn't care how you use Ajax. So you have a couple options. A lot of Vue people like a library called Axios. And so you'll see a lot of demos using Axios to handle doing Ajax type stuff. I prefer using Fetch because it's baked into modern browsers and it's pretty easy. Daniel's asking specifically about older browsers. So I am pretty darn sure Axios has older browser support. So basically any library you want to that supports a browser that you care about, Vue will integrate into that nicely. If you remember my demo with the created event where I just did Fetch, if you are using some other library, you would just change Fetch to that library.
Thanks for watching.